Laura slid the papers across the marble countertop with a sharp click, the sound of a designer pen meeting stone. She did it with practiced elegance, like she was offering me a gift, not a cage. 12 pages, notarized, covered in little red sign here flags. I looked up at her. She smiled, the same polished smile she wore at our engagement party when she told me my natural curls were so brave for such a formal event. The same smile she used at dinner when she asked, loud enough for the waiter to hear, whether my parents had a savings account or if they just lived for the moment. Always composed, always calculating, always in control. It's just a formality, Susan, she said softly. We have to protect the legacy. Not our legacy. The legacy. Like I was a temporary tenant in her son's life. Like the ring on my finger was nothing more than a visitor's pass to a world I didn't belong in. My name is Susan. I was 27 when I realized my mother-in-law had already decided who I was, a risk she needed to manage. What she didn't realize was that in her rush to control me, she'd left the back door to her son's entire future wide open. The prenup appeared 8 weeks before the wedding, and as I picked up the red pen, I saw the one thing her expensive lawyers had overlooked. I didn't just sign her document. I rewrote the ending of her son's life. The days following the signing felt like moving through a house made of glass. Expensive, beautiful, and dangerously sharp. To the outside world, I had become a part of the Whitmore legacy, a team player who had passed the ultimate test of loyalty. But inside the luxury cage, every interaction felt like a choreographed performance. The Whitmore estate was a masterpiece of muted joy, where the ceilings were high enough to make you feel small, and the artwork had no color, only texture. As if even a vibrant primary red would be too loud for a family this refined. Laura was everywhere, her polished appearance a constant reminder of the standard I was expected to meet. She began mentoring me, which really meant stripping away the parts of Susan that didn't fit the brand. She curated my wardrobe into a sea of neutrals and spoke about our future home as if I were a decorator she'd hired rather than the woman who would live there. We're building something that will last 40 years, she'd say, her smile never reaching her eyes. It was a phrase meant to sound like security, but after reading those 12 pages, I knew it was a sentence. The pressure to conform was immense, a low-level wrongness that hummed beneath the surface of every dinner and charity gala. I was surrounded by wealth I couldn't touch and a name I was only allowed to borrow. The ring on my finger felt less like a promise and more like a tracker, a gilded visitor's pass that Laura could revoke the moment I stepped out of line. Philip watched this transformation with a passive, relieved kind of approval. To him, the tension was gone because I had stopped fighting. He didn't see the way I spent my lunch hours in the back of the city library, or the way I had started documenting the financial assistance Laura was so eager to provide. He didn't realize that while I looked like I was settling into my cage, I was actually measuring the distance between the bars. I was learning to speak their language, the clinical, precise language of ownership and exclusion, so that when the time came, I could use it to set myself free. Philip sat beside me, but the space between us felt like a canyon I couldn't bridge. He wasn't flashy and had never tried too hard, which was exactly why I had fallen for him slowly in the beginning. But as I sat there with the red pen hovering over the signature line, he became someone I didn't recognize, a silent partner in my own containment. He didn't meet my eyes right away, instead choosing to focus on the steam rising from his coffee or the cuff of his shirt, anywhere but at the document that was meant to dismantle my future. "Philip?" I whispered, my voice a soft plea for some sign of the man I dated for 2 years, the one who split grocery bills and drove a used car to keep things honest. but his jaw was set in that specific flatness that signaled a recalibration of his loyalties. He had brought the document home and set it on the counter with a careful voice, claiming his mother was just protecting the estate and inheritance. He told me she wasn't trying to be offensive, but as the silence stretched, I realized he hadn't actually said no to her demands. He was the person his mother had been quietly building a life for without ever asking him what he actually wanted, and he was too comfortable in that architecture to challenge it. His support for Laura was reluctant but absolute. He was an accomplice by omission. While I picked through the clinical terms that ensured I would walk away with nothing if the marriage ended, Philip watched TV in the other room with the volume too high, trying not to listen to my silence. He wanted the life Laura provided, the trust funds and the real estate, without the discomfort of acknowledging the price I was being asked to pay. As I finally pressed the pen to the paper, I realized that Philip wasn't the architect of this trap, but he was certainly the one holding the door shut. He believed the version of our life he'd been shown, never noticing the rooms I was being barred from entering. His refusal to look at me was the final confirmation I needed. I wasn't just signing a document for Laura. I was signing a document for a man who had chosen to be a guest in his mother's legacy rather than a partner in our own. My name on the page was a visitor's pass, and for the first time, I accepted that I was standing on the outside of the family looking in. The red pen remained poised over the document, a thin line of plastic separating my old life from the one Laura had designed for me. As I stared at the section labeled Property Assets, my eyes snagged on a phrase that felt different from the rest, a technicality buried under layers of legalese. It was a clause regarding third-party financial assistance, intended to ensure that any money Laura funneled into our lives remained hers in spirit and law. But as I traced the words with the tip of the pen, I realized that the language was a two-way street. If her assistance was the foundation of the home, then any instability in that foundation belonged to her, too. That night, while the luxury apartment remained silent around me, I didn't sleep. I sat in the glow of my laptop, the volume muted as I began a clinical descent into property law and prenuptial amendments. I wasn't looking for a way out of the marriage. I was looking for a way to make it honest. I spent hours researching debt indemnification and marital asset ring fencing, phrases that felt like armor as I typed them into search bars. I even called a real estate attorney under the guise of a hypothetical inquiry, listening as she explained how easily gifts could be weaponized to maintain control. Slowly, the plan began to take shape, a single paragraph, 12 sentences long, that would act as a legal Trojan horse. My clause stipulated that if any third party used financial gifts or co-signed obligations to leverage control over our shared property, they would trigger a mandatory buyout process with all legal costs borne by them. It was airtight. It turned Laura's weaponized hospitality against her, ensuring that if she ever tried to use her wealth to orchestrate our lives, she would be paying lawyers to lose. I had my sister, Renee, review the draft 3 times, her silence on the other end of the phone telling me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just a technical change. It was a counterstrike. I was no longer the confused, submissive bride Laura saw in the foreground of her plans. I was becoming the architect of my own safety. By the time the sun began to bleed through the designer curtains, I had finished. I wasn't angry anymore. I was prepared. I knew that the version of our life we were building had rooms I'd never been shown, and it was time I started sealing the windows. I brought the document back to Laura on a Tuesday morning, the air in her sun-drenched study smelling of expensive lilies and old wood. She was already at her desk, her smooth, shoulder-length hair perfectly in place, looking every bit the architect of the world I was supposed to inhabit. I set the papers down gently, ensuring my posture remained slightly hunched, my expression mirroring the same nervous hesitation she had come to expect from me. "I've had a look through everything, Laura," I said, my voice quiet and careful. "Philip and I talked, and we're ready to move forward. But my sister, the one who works in law, noticed a small technical gap. Nothing major, just a bit of phrasing to protect the family from outside liability." Laura's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened, tracking my hand as I pointed to the new paragraph. I had framed it as a formality, using her own favorite word against her. I explained that in a world of aggressive litigation, we needed to ensure that the Whitmore name was shielded from any third-party complications arising from our shared marital assets. I told her it was about making the legacy airtight, ensuring that no outside force could ever use a gift or a co-signed loan to claw their way into the family's business. She leaned forward, her elegant, polished hands pulling the document closer. I held my breath as she read my 12 sentences. To someone like Laura, who viewed wealth as a weapon of control, the clause looked like a shield she had designed herself. It spoke of independent valuations and legal costs, terms that appealed to her clinical nature. She saw it as a way to keep me, and anyone else from my world, from ever claiming a piece of her empire. She didn't realize that by defining the third party so broadly, I had included her in the definition. "It's a bit unusual," she remarked, her thumb stroking the edge of the page. "But I suppose a bit of extra protection never hurts." "I just want to be a team player," I replied, forcing a small, shy smile. "I want to make sure I'm not a liability to the name." She nodded, satisfied by my apparent submissiveness. She signaled for her lawyer, Gerald, to review it, but I could see she had already made up her mind. In her eyes, I was still the younger woman reluctantly complying, the one who didn't know any better. She didn't see the Trojan horse I had just walked through her front gates. She didn't realize that under the guise of protecting her family, I had just legally ensured that her power over my home would trigger her own financial ruin. When she finally pushed the finalized version back toward me for the official signature, the red pen felt lighter in my hand. The visitor's pass was still there, but I had just rewritten the rules of the club. I signed with a steady hand, knowing that while Laura thought she was securing her legacy, she was actually signing off on the very clause that would eventually decouple me from the destruction she was hiding behind her polished smile. The celebratory dinner was held at an exclusive restaurant where the lighting was designed to make everyone look like a filtered version of themselves. Laura sat at the head of the table, the black silk of her blazer shimmering under the chandelier, looking every bit the victorious matriarch. She had invited a small circle of the family's closest associates, people who spoke in quiet tones about market shares and offshore trusts. It was the ultimate display of weaponized hospitality, a meal served with the kind of practiced warmth that was designed to remind me exactly who provided the table I was sitting at. "A toast," Laura announced, her voice cutting through the soft clink of silver against china. She raised a glass of vintage champagne, her smug, confident smile directed straight at me. "To legacy, to the strength of the Whitmore name and the wisdom of ensuring its future remains untarnished." Beside me, Philip raised his glass, his expression one of relieved compliance. He looked at his mother with a sense of gratitude, as if she had personally navigated us through a storm that he hadn't realized was of her own making. He didn't see the irony in her words, or the way she emphasized the family while looking right through me. To him, the signing of the prenup was a bridge crossed. To Laura, it was the final brick in the wall she had built around her son's life. I raised my glass as well, mirroring her precise, practiced composure. "To legacy," I repeated, my voice steady. As the table erupted into polite applause and murmurs of agreement, I felt a strange, cold sense of peace. Laura thought she was celebrating my surrender. She saw a younger woman who had finally learned her place, a team player who had accepted the terms of her visitor's pass. She didn't know that the small, technical change she dismissed as a formality was currently sitting in a digital vault, an airtight legal Trojan horse waiting for a reason to activate. Throughout the multi-course meal, I played my part perfectly. I laughed at the right moments, listened to stories of the Whitmore real estate empire, and accepted Laura's backhanded compliments as if they were genuine gifts. She spoke about the home she was helping us secure, her words dripping with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully orchestrated a person's entire existence. I kept my internal updates to myself, knowing that every time she mentioned financial assistance, she was effectively tightening the knot on her own future liabilities. I watched her across the table, polished, elegant, and entirely unaware. She had spent 40 years building an architecture of control, and she truly believed I was too naive to read the blueprint. What she never understood is that quiet doesn't mean unaware. While she toasted to a legacy that excluded me, I sat in the glow of the expensive lighting and knew that I had built an escape hatch she couldn't see. The dinner wasn't a celebration of her victory. It was the last meal she would ever eat under the illusion that I was powerless. The silence of the Whitmore estate had always felt like luxury, but as the weeks passed, I began to realize it was actually the silence of a vacuum. Everything was held in place by a precise artificial pressure, and I spent my nights looking for the leak. My sister Renee had taught me how to read between the lines of public records, and I began to apply those lessons to the legacy Laura was so desperate to protect. It started with a simple discrepancy in the property tax filings for one of the crown jewels of the Whitmore portfolio, a high-rise in the city center. On paper, it was a gold mine. In reality, the holding company was a nested doll of limited liability entities, each one siphoning funds to cover the interest on the one below it. I spent 4 days cross-referencing corporate registrations with debt notices I found buried in the fine print of local legal bulletins. I wasn't just looking at numbers. I was looking at a house of cards. The old money Laura boasted about wasn't a mountain. It was a mirage. The Whitmore real estate empire was built on a foundation of massive, undisclosed corporate debt that had been refinanced so many times the paperwork was starting to fray at the edges. Laura hadn't been protecting the family from me. She had been protecting the secret that there was almost nothing left to protect. The luxury interior that had once made me feel small now looked like a stage set. The artwork with no color, the pale furniture, the high ceilings, it was all a distraction, a clinical mask designed to hide the rot. Philip was a regular guy not because he chose to be modest, but because the family's liquidity was a myth. He drove a used car and worked a desk job because the trusts he spoke of were mostly ledger entries in a game of financial musical chairs. When I found the final piece, a notice of default on the very property Laura had gifted to us in secret, the low-level wrongness I had felt since the engagement finally had a name. It wasn't just that she wanted to control my life. She wanted to use my clean credit and my personal savings as a fresh infusion of capital for her dying empire. The original prenup had been structured to ensure that if the ship sank, I was the only one who wouldn't be allowed a lifeboat. I sat at the kitchen table in the middle of the night, the glow of the laptop reflecting in the window, and I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. The architecture of my marriage had been designed as a trap, but because I had refused to be passive, I was the only one who knew the foundation was cracking. Laura's smugness was her greatest liability. She was so convinced of her own superiority that she never imagined the submissive girl with the red pen would be the one to discover that the Whitmores were broke. I closed the laptop, the heavy click sounding like the first stone falling from a wall. The escape hatch I had built was no longer just a precaution. It was a necessity. The atmosphere of the house changed the moment Laura requested a family meeting in the formal library. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the artificial warmth of the fireplace, a setting designed to remind me of the weight of the Whitmore history. Laura sat behind the mahogany desk, her elegant, polished hands folded over a new set of documents, while Philip stood by the window, his back to me as he watched the rain hit the glass. "Susan, dear, we've hit a bit of a snag," Laura began, her voice carrying that same weaponized hospitality she used when she was about to demand a sacrifice. She spoke about a temporary liquidity issue in the estate, a family emergency involving one of the commercial holdings that required an immediate infusion of capital to protect the legacy. She leaned forward with that smug, confident smile, pushing a withdrawal authorization form toward me. "Since you're part of the team now, and the prenuptial agreement we all signed outlines our shared commitment to the family's stability, we've decided the best move is to utilize your personal savings account as a short-term bridge. It's exactly the kind of financial assistance the document was designed to facilitate." I looked at the paper. She wasn't just asking. She was telling me that my personal independence, the modest life I had built before the engagement, was now a resource for her to strip. She was attempting to use the very document she'd forced me to sign to seize my assets, banking on the idea that I was still the confused, submissive girl who would do anything to remain in her good graces. "Philip," I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't turn around. "It's for the family, Susan. My mom says it's the only way to keep the Aldrich Street property from going into default. We're all making sacrifices." The trap had been sprung. Laura thought she had backed me into a corner where my only choices were to comply or admit I didn't care about our future home, the house she had secretly bought to ensure I remained a long-term guest in my own marriage. She believed that because she had provided hospitality, she now owned my autonomy. I looked back at Laura, who was waiting with an expectant, slightly bored expression, as if my consent were a foregone conclusion. She didn't realize that by invoking the prenup to grab my savings, she had just stepped onto the tripwire I had laid weeks ago. She was the third party now, attempting to exert influence and ownership over our marital stability through financial assistance. "I understand," I said, my hand reaching for the red pen I now carried in my own bag. "But before I sign this, we need to talk about the clause I added. The one about mandatory independent valuations and legal buyouts." The smugness on her face didn't disappear. It froze. She had spent so long orchestrating a version of my life where I was powerless that she had forgotten to check if the cage door was actually locked. The low-level wrongness I'd lived with for months finally crystallized into a sharp, cold clarity. The battle wasn't just beginning. It was already over. I wasn't the one who was trapped. She was. I opened my bag and pulled out the finalized, notarized copy of the agreement, the one Laura had signed with such smug satisfaction just weeks ago. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply turned to the page with my 12-sentence clause and slid it across the mahogany desk, mirroring the way she had once slid it toward me. "You should read the third-party indemnification section again, Laura," I said, my voice carrying a clinical flatness that seemed to chill the room. "The one you agreed was a formality to protect the legacy." Her eyes scanned the text, and for the first time the polished mask slipped. The clause was airtight. It explicitly stated that if any third party, including family, attempted to use financial leverage or co-signed obligations to influence our marital assets, it triggered a mandatory, independent valuation and a total legal buyout. But there was a second edge to the blade I had sharpened in those midnight research sessions. By framing the family's assistance as a third-party obligation, I had legally decoupled my own assets from the Whitmore bloodline's liabilities. By demanding my savings to cover your default, you've officially initiated the buyout process, I explained, watching the color drain from her face. But because this debt is tied to the estate's corporate holdings, assets I have no claim to under your original terms, the legal and financial responsibility for those failures remains entirely with the original heirs, with you and Philip. Philip finally turned away from the window, his face a mask of confusion and rising panic. Susan, what are you saying? I'm saying that the house of cards is falling, Philip, and I'm the only one standing outside of it, I said, looking him in the eye for the first time that evening. The independent valuation has already been triggered by your mother's request. But here's the problem. When the auditors look at the books to find the money to buy out my interest in this marriage, they're going to find nothing but debt. Laura's hand trembled as she gripped the edge of the desk. She had built a version of our marriage where I was a long-term guest, a person with no key that actually worked. She had intended to use my life to patch the holes in her own. But my clause had flipped the architecture. The legal buyout required the initiating party, her, to bear all costs. She was now legally obligated to pay for a process that would expose her insolvency to the world. There was no money left to buy me out, and no way to force me to stay and sync with them. The bloodline was now legally tethered to its own destruction, while I was free. I had spent months being the submissive bride, the quiet observer, but as the silence in the library became suffocating, I realized that my refusal to move into a house I wasn't allowed to own was finally enough. The foundation had cracked, and for the first time, I wasn't the one afraid of the fall. The luxury interior that had once felt like an impenetrable fortress began to disintegrate in the weeks that followed. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a clinical, systematic dismantling. Because the independent valuation I triggered had exposed the family's insolvency to the bank's auditors, the Whitmore legacy was revealed for what it truly was. A house of cards held together by posturing and redirected loans. I watched from the periphery as the polished world Laura had spent 40 years curating began to tilt. The high-end furniture was catalogued. The artwork with no color was appraised for liquidation. And the family emergency Laura had tried to solve with my savings became a public foreclosure. The banks didn't care about weaponized hospitality or precise smiles. They only cared about the massive, undisclosed corporate debt that now sat squarely on the shoulders of the original bloodline. Philip's life was destroyed not by my hand, but by the weight of the architecture he had refused to question. Without the infusion of capital from the submissive wife he'd expected me to be, he was left standing in the wreckage of a dynasty that had no actual foundation. He sat in the middle of our half-packed apartment, his face pale and eyes hollow, finally realizing that the regular life he thought he chose was the only life he could actually afford. He looked at me as if I were a stranger, unable to reconcile the woman who had signed with a red pen with the woman now standing by the door with a suitcase. I didn't leave with anger. I left with my dignity and my natural look, uncurated by Laura's neutral-toned wardrobe or her expectations of who I should be. I walked away from the luxury real estate and the commercial buildings that were only ever ink on a page, realizing that the visitor's pass Laura had handed me was actually my greatest gift. It had kept me outside just long enough to see the cracks in the walls before they collapsed. I moved into a small, honest apartment on the other side of the city, a place where the lease was in my name and the keys actually worked. I think about what would have happened if I had just signed that original document without looking for the gaps. I would have lived in a house I wasn't allowed to own, tethered to a family that would have drained me dry to save themselves. I might never have known that the low-level wrongness I felt was the sound of a foundation crumbling. I didn't expose Laura to the world. I didn't have to. I simply read the document she handed me and wrote back. She made the mistake of assuming that my quietness was a lack of awareness, and that my politeness was a lack of power. What she never understood is that patient doesn't mean passive. I didn't win a war. I just refused to inhabit a cage, even one made of gold. And as I looked at my reflection in the window of my new, simple home, I realized that being real was the only legacy worth keeping.